Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling and unexplained cases ever documented in the American history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We are interested to know how far these documented accounts reach and at what moments of day or night they find their listeners. The master of Mississippi always chose the weakest man to fight, but no one expected what came next. In the heart of Mississippi in 1858, Master Calvin Thornwood had a brutal ritual. Whenever a slave stopped being productive, he called them for one final fight right there in the middle of the plantation under the scorching sun in front of everyone. The rule was simple: win and earn your freedom, lose and die fighting. For the master, it was a way to dispose of those who no longer served him and to fill the others with terror. He would call anyone, an old man, a weak young worker, even a sick boy. His violence was the plantation spectacle. 23 men had faced him. 23 men had died. But on a humid August morning, something different happened. The man Thornwood called that day had been acting strangely for weeks, moving slower, coughing more, stumbling in the fields. Everyone thought he was dying. Everyone except one person. When the master issued the challenge, the plantation fell into absolute silence. The weak man stepped forward. No fear in his eyes, no hesitation in his steps. And in that moment, some of the older slaves recognized something. A pattern they'd seen before. A strategy older than the plantation itself. What happened next would change everything. But the master had no idea what was coming. Before we continue this incredible story of vengeance, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment which city you're watching this fight from. Let's keep going. Thornwood Plantation sat on 4,000 acres of Mississippi Delta land, rich, dark soil that produced cotton in abundance. The kind of land that made white men wealthy and black people suffer. In 1858, the plantation was at peak production. 312 slaves worked from dawn until dark, 6 days a week, with only Sunday afternoons for rest. They lived in rows of crude cabins behind the main house, slept on wooden pallets, ate rations of cornmeal and salt pork, wore clothes made from the cheapest fabric, existed in a state of permanent exhaustion and fear. Calvin Thornwood owned all of this, had inherited the plantation from his father, Richard Thornwood, in 1851. Calvin was 28 years old when he became master. Young, ambitious, and determined to prove himself even more successful than his father. Richard had been a traditional plantation owner. Cruel, yes, but predictably cruel. Whipping for infractions, sales to separate families, overwork until bodies broke, standard methods of control that every plantation used. But Calvin wanted something more. Wanted absolute dominance. Wanted his slaves to fear him in ways they'd never feared his father. He studied methods of control, read books about breaking horses, applied those principles to breaking people, developed techniques of psychological torture, of unpredictable violence, of spectacles designed to traumatize and terrorize. And his most effective spectacle was the fights. The ritual started in March 1855. A slave named Abraham had turned 63 that year. His hands were gnarled with arthritis. His back was permanently bent from decades of field work. He couldn't keep up with the younger workers. Slowed down his picking crew. Calvin watched him struggling for a week. Then one morning called him to the center of the workyard. Announced to the assembled slaves that Abraham would fight him. If Abraham won, he'd be freed. If he lost, well, he wouldn't need freedom anymore. Abraham was terrified, knew he had no chance against a healthy young master. But what choice did he have? Refuse and be whipped to death. At least fighting gave him a slim possibility of survival. So he fought, raised his arthritic fists, tried to defend himself. Calvin toyed with him for 30 seconds, let him throw weak punches that missed. Then Calvin struck back. One massive blow to Abraham's jaw. The old man went down. Didn't get up. Calvin kicked him in the ribs, in the head, in the back. Kept kicking until Abraham stopped moving, stopped breathing, died in the dirt while 300 people watched. Calvin stood over the body, breathing hard, covered in Abraham's blood, and he smiled, looked around at the terrified faces. Anyone else want to slow down? Want to become useless? This is what happens. This is what awaits you. The message was clear. Work until you drop or die fighting. Those were the only options. The other plantation owners heard about Calvin's method. Some criticized it. Charles Morrison from the neighboring plantation told Calvin he was destroying valuable property, that selling old or sick slaves was more economical than killing them. But Calvin disagreed. Fear is worth more than the sale price of a worn-out slave. One dead man in the dirt teaches 100 others to work harder. That increased productivity pays for the loss. And he was right. In the months after Abraham's death, productivity on Thornwood Plantation increased 12%. People worked through pain, hid illness, pushed beyond their limits because the alternative was the circle, was the master's fists, was death in front of everyone. The system worked and Calvin kept using it. Over 3 years, 23 men died in that circle. Not all old, not all sick. Some were just unlucky. Had an accident that left them partially disabled. Got a fever that weakened them. Developed a cough that persisted. Anything that marked them as less than fully productive made them targets. Calvin would watch, would wait until someone couldn't hide their weakness anymore, then call them out, make them fight, make them die. The 23 deaths had names, had histories, had families who mourned them. Abraham was first, then Isaac, who'd broken his leg and never healed properly. Then Moses, who'd developed a lung disease. Then Samuel, whose back injury made him unable to lift heavy loads. Then Josiah, who'd gone partially blind. One by one, month by month, the death toll accumulated and the fear intensified. But fear also breeds other things. Resentment, hatred, and in some people determination to resist. The slaves couldn't rebel openly. Mississippi law was designed to prevent that. Any gathering of more than 5 slaves without white supervision was illegal. Teaching slaves to read was illegal. Slaves testifying against whites in court was illegal. The entire legal system was designed to make organized resistance impossible. But the slaves found other ways. Quiet ways, patient ways, ways that wouldn't be obvious until the moment they acted. Elijah was one of those patient ones. Born in 1824 on a plantation in South Carolina. His mother's name was Ruth. His father's name he never knew. Could have been any of several white men who raped his mother over the years. Elijah was sold at age 15 when his original master died and the estate was liquidated. A trader bought him, chained him to a coffle with 20 other slaves, marched them overland to Mississippi, sold them at auction in Jackson. Elijah went to Richard Thornwood for $850. Considered a good investment, young, strong, intelligent enough to learn tasks quickly, but not so intelligent as to be dangerous. Elijah had been on Thornwood Plantation for 19 years. Had watched Richard Thornwood run it for 4 years. Had watched Calvin take over in 1851. Had seen the transition from traditional brutality to Calvin's refined sadism. Had witnessed all 23 deaths in the circle. And through all of it, Elijah had been careful, had played the role of the good slave, hard worker, obedient, non-threatening, never gave the overseers reason to notice him, never drew attention, just survived and watched, always watched. Because Elijah was learning, was studying Calvin's methods, was analyzing how the fights worked. Calvin was strong, no question. 6 feet tall, 200 pounds of muscle, had natural athletic ability, but he wasn't trained. Didn't know formal fighting techniques. Relied on rage and strength, relied on his opponents being weak, terrified, and unable to defend themselves effectively. Against old men and sick boys, that was enough. But what would happen against someone who could actually fight back? Someone young and strong who knew what they were doing. The question fascinated Elijah, but he had no combat training, no knowledge of fighting beyond the desperate brawls that occasionally broke out between slaves, no techniques that would let him defeat a man who outweighed him by 40 pounds. So Elijah did something quietly revolutionary. He sought knowledge from the oldest people on the plantation, the ones who remembered Africa, the ones who'd been brought over on slave ships, the ones who carried memories of lives before bondage. There was a woman named Sarah. She'd been on Thornwood Plantation for 43 years, had been brought from West Africa in 1815 at age 22, had survived the Middle Passage, had survived 4 decades of slavery. She was 65 years old in 1858. Too old for heavy field work, but kept alive because she was valuable as a midwife and healer. Knew herbs and medicines, could deliver babies and treat illnesses. The plantation needed her skills even if her body was failing. Sarah also knew things the white people didn't know. Combat techniques from her homeland. The Igbo people from what's now Nigeria had warrior traditions, knew how to fight larger opponents, knew pressure points and vulnerable areas on the human body, knew how to turn an enemy's strength against them. This knowledge had no use in slavery, would only get you killed if you tried to use it. But Sarah remembered, and when Elijah approached her quietly one evening, when he asked if she knew how to fight, she understood what he was planning. "You want to face the master?" she said. It wasn't a question. They were alone near the well. Nobody could overhear. Elijah nodded. "I'm tired of watching people die. Tired of living in fear. I want to do something. Even if it kills me. Want to at least try." Sarah studied him. Saw the determination. Saw the anger that had been building for 19 years, finally spoke. "I can teach you. Not everything, that would take years, but enough. Enough to maybe win a fight if your opponent doesn't expect resistance." Over the next months, Sarah taught Elijah in secret. After dark and hidden places, she showed him where to strike for maximum damage, the solar plexus to knock the wind out, the liver to cause debilitating pain, the throat to choke, the eyes to blind, the knees to break. She taught him how to use leverage, how a smaller person could throw a larger one, how to redirect force rather than oppose it directly. She taught him footwork, how to move, how to avoid strikes, how to create angles. Ancient knowledge passed down through generations, now weaponized for one desperate purpose. But knowledge alone wasn't enough. Elijah needed opportunity, needed Calvin to choose him for the circle. But Calvin only chose the weak, the obviously failing. So Elijah had to become weak, had to convince everyone, including Calvin, that he was declining, that he was becoming a liability, that he deserved to be called out. In June 1858, Elijah began his performance, started moving slower in the fields, would drop his cotton sack as if his hands couldn't grip properly, would stumble over nothing, would cough frequently as if developing lung disease. Small things at first, easy to dismiss as temporary, but consistent. Day after day, week after week, the performance intensified. Elijah lost weight deliberately, ate less, made himself look gaunt, hollowed his cheeks, slumped his shoulders to appear smaller, made his movements labored, made it look like every task cost him tremendous effort. The overseers noticed. Marcus Kane was head overseer, a brutal man who'd held the position for 6 years. He reported to Calvin that Elijah seemed to be declining rapidly. "Don't know what's wrong with him. Maybe consumption, maybe just worn out, but he's becoming a problem, slowing down his whole work crew." Calvin came to observe, watched Elijah for several days, saw the stumbling, the coughing, the apparent weakness, decided Elijah was used up, would soon need to be disposed of, started planning the next demonstration. But there was one person who saw through Elijah's act. Sarah knew obviously because she was helping him plan it. But there was also a young woman named Grace. She was 23 years old, had been born on the plantation, was beautiful despite the hardships of slavery, and she was in love with Elijah. They'd been together for 2 years, not married. Slaves couldn't legally marry, but together in every way that mattered. Grace knew Elijah better than anyone. Knew his real strength, knew his intelligence, and she realized what he was doing. She confronted him one night. They were alone in his cabin. "You're planning something. Planning to get called to the circle. Planning to fight Calvin." Elijah didn't deny it. Couldn't lie to her. "I have to do something. Can't just wait to get old and die in that circle like everyone else." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "You'll die anyway. Even if you win the fight, they'll kill you afterward. You know that. There's no escape from this." Elijah took her hands. "Maybe, probably. But I'd rather die fighting than die begging. Rather die trying to hurt him than die for his entertainment. And maybe I won't die. Maybe there's a way to survive this, to escape, to be free." Grace wanted to believe him, wanted to think there was hope. But she'd watched 23 men die. Had no reason to think Elijah would be different. "If you do this," she said, "if you go through with this, I'm losing you. One way or another, you'll be gone." "Then come with me," Elijah said. "If I somehow survive, if I somehow escape, come with me. We'll run together, find freedom together." Grace pulled away. "That's a dream. A fantasy. No one escapes Mississippi. The slave catchers always find you. Always bring you back. And even if you made it north, I'm a woman. I can't run like you can. I'd slow you down. Get us both caught." She was crying now. "I love you, but I won't watch you die in that circle. When they call you out, I'll look away. I can't watch it happen." Elijah understood. It was too much to ask, too much to expect anyone to witness. He held her while she cried, memorized the feel of her, the smell of her, knowing this might be their last night together, that his plan would either lead to freedom or death, that either way, this life was ending. After she left, Elijah lay awake. Thought about turning back, about abandoning the plan, about just continuing to survive. But he couldn't. Had gone too far. Had committed too completely. Had to see it through. The call came on August 15, 1858. A Monday morning, humid even at dawn. The temperature would reach 95 degrees by noon. The field slaves assembled in the workyard for their assignments. The overseers were organizing crews when Calvin emerged from the big house. He was dressed casually, white linen shirt, dark trousers, leather boots. He walked with the confidence of someone who'd never lost, someone who'd killed 23 men and felt invincible. Marcus Kane rang the bell. 3 sharp strikes, the signal that meant stop everything. The signal that meant someone was about to die. All work stopped. All 312 slaves assembled. They knew what was coming. Had seen it 23 times before. Knew every detail of the ritual. The circle marked in dirt. The fight that wasn't really a fight. The inevitable death. Some looked resigned. Some looked terrified. All looked trapped. Calvin surveyed the crowd. Let the tension build. Let the fear spread. Enjoyed the power of the moment. Finally spoke. "We've got dead weight on this plantation. People not pulling their share. People taking resources without producing value." His eyes found Elijah in the crowd. Elijah stepped forward. The crowd parted, created a path. Elijah walked through it, head down, shoulders slumped, every movement suggesting exhaustion and defeat. He stopped 15 feet from Calvin. Didn't look up. Played his role perfectly. "You've been declining," Calvin said, "getting weak, becoming useless. I've been watching you, seen you stumbling around, coughing, acting like you can barely work. So, we're going to settle this the usual way. You and me, right here, right now. Same rules as always. You win, you're free, you lose. He smiled. That terrible smile the slaves had learned to fear. Well, you won't have to worry about being tired anymore. The white overseers laughed. They stood in a loose circle around the workyard. 6 of them, all armed with whips and clubs, all there to prevent any slave from interfering, all confident in the outcome. They'd seen this 23 times. Knew how it ended. Another dead slave. Another reminder of who had power. Another day at Thornwood Plantation. But something happened that made Calvin pause. Elijah raised his head, looked directly into Calvin's eyes, and smiled. Not a submissive smile, not a fearful smile, a knowing smile. The smile of someone who has a secret. I accept your challenge, Master. Let's see what happens. The way Elijah said, Master, was wrong. Carried mockery. Carried disrespect. Carried confidence that shouldn't exist. Calvin felt something unfamiliar, a flutter of doubt. But he'd issued the challenge, had witnesses, couldn't back down now without looking weak. Marcus, mark the circle, he ordered. Marcus Kane used a stick to scratch a circle in the dirt, 20 feet in diameter, standard size. 23 men had died within that circle. About to be 24. Calvin removed his shirt, revealed his physique, 6 feet tall, 200 pounds of muscle, arms thick from years of riding and manual work, chest broad, shoulders powerful. He was in his prime at 35 years old. Looked like what he was, a dangerous man. The slaves who'd never seen him without a shirt murmured. Their fear intensified. How could anyone fight that? Then Elijah removed his shirt and everything changed. His body wasn't wasted at all. Was lean and defined. Muscles clearly visible under skin. Scars everywhere. But just arms. Testimony to 19 years of slavery. But underneath the scars was strength. Real strength. Not the appearance of weakness he'd been showing for 2 months. His actual body. Grace gasped. Sarah nodded slightly. A few of the older slaves who'd suspected smiled grimly. The deception was revealed. Calvin stared, felt rage building. You've been playing me, pretending to be weak, making a fool of me. Elijah shrugged. You chose to believe what you saw. Chose to think I was dying. That's not my fault. That's yours. The insolence was shocking. Slaves didn't talk to masters like that. Didn't show defiance. Didn't mock. Calvin's hands clenched into fists. I'm going to kill you slowly. Going to make you regret every word, every lie, every moment you thought you were clever. Maybe, Elijah said, or maybe today is the day you learn you're not invincible, that you can be beaten, that you can die. He rolled his shoulders, loosened his neck, bounced on the balls of his feet, moved like someone who knew how to use his body, like someone who trained. Calvin felt doubt intensify, but also rage. This slave needed to be destroyed, needed to be made an example, needed to die badly. Marcus dropped his hand. The fight began. Calvin charged immediately, used his standard tactic, overwhelming aggression, rush forward, drive the opponent back with size and violence, had worked 23 times. But Elijah didn't retreat, didn't panic, stepped to the side at the last second, let Calvin's momentum carry him past. As Calvin stumbled by, Elijah drove his elbow into Calvin's ribs, hard, precisely placed, used all his weight and leverage. The impact broke 2 ribs. Calvin gasped. Pain exploded through his chest. He'd never been hurt in these fights. Never felt real pain. Had always been the one inflicting it. The shock was almost as bad as the injury. He turned, faced Elijah. Saw the slave was smiling again. That's for Abraham, Elijah said quietly. For the first man you killed. Calvin roared, charged again, swung a massive fist at Elijah's head, but Elijah ducked under it, came up inside Calvin's guard, drove 3 rapid punches into his torso. Solar plexus, liver, kidney, Sarah's teaching, strike the soft targets, cause maximum pain, disable rather than just hurt. Calvin staggered. Each punch had landed perfectly. His breath came in gasps. The broken ribs made every inhalation agony. The liver shot sent nauseating pain through his abdomen. The kidney strike made his back spasm. He was hurt, seriously hurt, and the fight had barely started. The crowd of slaves watched in absolute silence. This wasn't following the script. The master was supposed to win easily, was supposed to beat the slave to death within minutes. But Elijah was winning, was dominating, was making Calvin look slow and clumsy. The implications were staggering. If the master could be beaten, if he could be hurt, then maybe he wasn't as powerful as he seemed. Maybe the system wasn't as strong. Maybe resistance was possible. Calvin tried to grapple, tried to use his weight advantage, charged again. This time got his arms around Elijah, lifted him off the ground, tried to throw him, but Elijah twisted, used techniques Sarah had taught him, found leverage points, shifted his weight, turned Calvin's strength against him, somehow reversed the throw. Calvin found himself flying through the air, hit the ground hard, dust erupting around him, breath knocked out of his lungs. Before he could recover, Elijah was on him. Mounted his chest, fists raining down, face, throat, temples. Each strike calculated, each one designed to cause maximum damage. Calvin tried to cover up, tried to protect his head, but the strikes kept coming. His nose shattered, blood poured from his nostrils, his lips split, teeth broke, eyes began swelling shut. The beating was systematic, methodical. 19 years of accumulated anger channeled into focused violence. Marcus Cain started moving forward, started to intervene. The master was losing, was being beaten badly. This couldn't be allowed to continue. But Sarah stepped directly into his path. An old woman blocking a young overseer. The master said it was a fair fight. She said loudly, loud enough for everyone to hear. Said the rules were simple. Win and earn freedom, lose and die. Those were his words. You interfere now. You prove his word means nothing. Prove he can't win his own fights. Marcus hesitated. She was right. Calvin had made this public. Had announced the rules in front of witnesses. If the overseers interfered, it would undermine everything. Would show that the master's promises were lies, would show he couldn't win without help. The other overseers looked at each other uncertain, wanting to help, but trapped by the rules Calvin himself had created. In the circle, the beating continued. Elijah's fist struck down again and again. Calvin was barely conscious. His face was destroyed, blood everywhere, bones broken. He tried weakly to push Elijah off, but he had no strength left, no leverage, no defense. He was being beaten to death in front of his own slaves, in front of his overseers, in front of everyone who was supposed to fear him. Finally, Elijah stopped, stood, looked down at Calvin, who was semi-conscious, bleeding heavily, barely breathing. You said I'd win my freedom, Elijah said loud enough for everyone to hear. You said those were the rules. You lose, I'm free. That's what you promised. He looked around at the assembled crowd, making sure every witness heard. Establishing his claim. I won according to your own rules. I'm free. For a moment, nobody moved. The slaves were in shock. The whites were paralyzed by disbelief. Then Marcus found his voice. You're a dead man. You know that, right? Even if you won the fight, you can't walk away from this. We'll hunt you down. We'll kill you. And it'll be slow. It'll be painful. We'll make an example that lasts for days. Elijah nodded. Probably. But for right now, for these few minutes, I'm free. I beat him. I won. And I want everyone here to remember this. Remember that he's just a man, that he bleeds, that he can be beaten. Remember that you don't have to accept this, that resistance is possible. He looked directly at the slaves. Spoke to them, not to the whites. Remember me. Remember what happened here. And when your moment comes, when you get your chance, be ready. Be brave. Fight back. That's when the other whites arrived. Plantation owners from neighboring properties who'd been visiting. Guests from the big house who'd been watching from the porch. Other overseers who'd been working distant fields. They came running when they heard the commotion. Came to restore order, to punish this insurrection, to make an example. Within minutes, 20 white men surrounded Elijah. All armed, some with guns, some with whips, some with clubs. 20 against 1. No chance of survival. But Sarah had planned for this, had spent weeks preparing, had recruited allies, had created contingency plans. The moment the whites started closing in on Elijah, she shouted one word, a word in Igbo, her native African language, a word the whites didn't understand. Now, and the plantation exploded into coordinated chaos. 60 slaves moved at once, not attacking the whites. That would have been suicide, but creating confusion, running in different directions, screaming, making noise, dropping tools with loud crashes, creating sensory overload. The whites couldn't focus on Elijah because they were being overwhelmed by motion and sound and confusion. Couldn't shoot into the crowd without hitting each other or valuable property. Were momentarily paralyzed. In that chaos, Elijah ran, sprinted toward the tree-line, toward the woods, toward the slim chance of escape. The whites started firing. Gunshots cracked through the humid air. Bullets buzzed past Elijah. Most missed, but one caught him in the left shoulder. The impact spun him, dropped him to one knee. Pain exploded through his upper body, but he forced himself up, kept running, made it to the trees, disappeared into the forest. Behind him, the plantation descended into chaos. Whites shouting orders, dogs barking, the hunt beginning. But the chaos bought Elijah precious time. By the time the whites organized a pursuit, by the time they got the dogs ready, Elijah had a 15-minute head start, and he'd prepared for this. Had spent weeks planning escape routes. Had marked trees with subtle signs only he would recognize. Had hidden supplies along possible paths. Had created false trails. Had done everything he could to maximize his chances of survival. The bullet wound in his shoulder was bad but not fatal. The round had passed through the muscle without hitting bone or major blood vessels. It hurt terribly, bled heavily, would probably get infected, but it wouldn't stop him immediately. He ran for an hour, put distance between himself and the plantation, then stopped at a hidden cache, pulled out supplies he'd buried weeks earlier, cloth for bandaging, a knife, dried food, a canteen of water, worked quickly to bind his wound, stopped the bleeding, then kept moving. The next 3 days were a blur of pain and determination. Elijah moved mostly at night, slept in hidden places during the day, followed streams to mask his scent from the dogs, avoided roads and settlements, survived on the supplies he'd cached and on foraged food. The wound in his shoulder became infected on the second day. Fever set in. His body shook with chills despite the August heat, but he kept moving north. Always north, following the North Star, following the path to freedom. Behind him, Thornwood Plantation was in turmoil. Calvin survived the beating, but barely. Spent 2 weeks in bed. Doctor from town said he'd live, but would never be the same. Broken bones, healed wrong, face permanently disfigured, lost his right eye, suffered constant pain from his injuries. But worse than the physical damage was the psychological wound. He'd been beaten publicly by a slave. Everyone had seen his mystique was shattered, his authority destroyed. He was just a man who could bleed and lose and be humiliated. The other plantation owners were horrified. Not by Calvin's methods, most approved of those, but by his failure. He'd shown weakness, had allowed a slave to defeat him, had created a dangerous precedent. The story spread rapidly. Within days, every slave in the county knew about Elijah beating Master Thornwood. The story gave them hope, gave them ideas, gave them belief that resistance was possible. The plantation owners knew this was dangerous, tried to suppress the story, claimed Elijah had cheated somehow, claimed Calvin had been ill, made excuses. But the slaves knew the truth, had seen it, and couldn't be convinced otherwise. Calvin sent slave catchers after Elijah, professional bounty hunters who specialized in tracking runaways, offered a $1,000 reward, an enormous sum, enough to motivate hunters from multiple states. They searched for weeks, found signs of Elijah's passage, blood on leaves from his wounded shoulder, footprints in mud, evidence he'd camped in certain locations, but they never caught him. Never even got close. Because Elijah had help. The Underground Railroad, the secret network that helped escaped slaves reach free states. Conductors had been watching Thornwood Plantation, had heard about Calvin's brutality, had been looking for ways to help. When they learned about Elijah's escape, about his brave fight, they mobilized resources, found him in Tennessee. He was barely alive. Infection had nearly killed him. Body wasted from fever and lack of food. But he'd made it out of Mississippi, was in reach of freedom. The conductors hid Elijah in a root cellar for 2 weeks, treated his infected wound, fed him, let him recover strength, then moved him along the network from Tennessee to Kentucky, from Kentucky to Ohio. Each leg of the journey risky, each border crossing dangerous. But the conductors were experienced, had moved hundreds of escaped slaves, knew the routes, knew the safe houses, knew how to avoid slave catchers. In October 1858, Elijah crossed into Ohio, collapsed in the home of a Quaker family named Miller, was delirious with fever. The Millers nursed him back to health. Took weeks, but slowly Elijah recovered. His shoulder healed, his strength returned. And for the first time in his life, he was free. Actually legally free, standing on free soil. No longer property, a human being with rights. But freedom came with grief. Elijah had left people behind. Grace, the woman he loved. Sarah, who taught him how to fight. The 60 slaves who'd created chaos to help him escape. He learned later that Sarah had been whipped nearly to death as punishment for her role, that 3 other slaves had been sold south, that Grace had been sold to a plantation in Alabama. All because they'd helped him. The guilt was crushing. He'd won his freedom at the cost of their suffering. Elijah tried to return for them, tried to organize a rescue, contacted abolitionists, offered to guide a raid, but they refused. Too dangerous, too likely to fail, too likely to get everyone killed. Told him the best thing he could do was survive, build a life, prove that escape was possible, be a symbol of hope. It wasn't the answer he wanted, but it was the only realistic one. In 1861, the Civil War started. Elijah immediately volunteered. Joined the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, one of the first black regiments. Was 37 years old but strong and experienced. Fought at Island Mound in October 1862. Fought at Honey Springs in July 1863. Survived multiple battles. Rose to sergeant. Led men in combat. Killed Confederate soldiers without hesitation or guilt. Each one represented the system that had enslaved him. Each death was justice. When the war ended in 1865, Elijah was 41 years old. He returned to Mississippi as part of the occupying Union forces, went back to Thornwood Plantation, found it burned, abandoned. Calvin had fled when Union troops approached, never returned. The plantation was seized by the government. The land was supposed to be redistributed to freed slaves, but that promise was broken. Eventually, the land was sold to northern investors. The freed slaves got nothing. Elijah found Sarah still there. She'd survived the war, was 72 years old, free, but with nowhere to go, no resources, no support. Elijah took her north, got her settled in Cincinnati, paid for her care, visited her regularly, listened to her stories. She lived 3 more years, died in 1868. Her last words to Elijah were, "You made it count. You made my sacrifice worth something. Thank you." Elijah tried to find Grace, learned she'd been sold multiple times. Last known location was a plantation near Mobile, Alabama. But by the time he traced her there in 1866, she was gone, dead from cholera in 1864. Never knew that slavery ended. Never knew that Elijah had survived. Never got to experience freedom. The loss devastated Elijah. He'd hoped to find her, to reunite, to build a life together. But that dream died with her. Elijah settled in Ohio, married a woman named Rebecca in 1867. She was a former slave from Kentucky, understood his pain, his nightmares, his survivor's guilt. They built a life together, had 7 children, worked hard, bought land, farmed, raised their children in freedom, taught them to read and write, sent them to school, gave them opportunities he'd never had. But Elijah never forgot August 15, 1858. Never forgot the fight. Never forgot the people who'd helped him. He told the story often to his children, to his grandchildren, to anyone who would listen, made sure it was recorded, made sure it was preserved. The story of the day a slave beat his master in single combat. The day the impossible happened. The day one man's courage inspired hundreds. Elijah lived until 1903, died at age 79, had 14 grandchildren by then, 23 great-grandchildren, all free, all educated, all aware of what their grandfather had done. His funeral was attended by over 200 people, black and white. Veterans who'd served with him, abolitionists who'd helped him escape, family who loved him, friends who respected him. They buried him in a cemetery outside Cincinnati. His gravestone read, Elijah Freeman, born into bondage 1824, died in freedom 1903. He fought back. The story of Elijah and Calvin spread through multiple communities. The black community preserved it carefully, passed it down through generations, told it as proof that masters could be beaten, that the system could be resisted, that courage mattered. The story was embellished over time. Some versions said Elijah killed Calvin. Some said he freed all the slaves on the plantation. Some said he was 70 tall and killed 10 men with his bare hands. Exaggerations, but all based on the core truth that a slave had beaten his master and escaped to freedom. White historians tried to suppress the story, claimed it never happened, claimed there was no documentation, claimed it was a myth created to inspire slave rebellions, but too much evidence existed. Court records showed Calvin Thornwood owned a plantation in Mississippi. Census records showed he owned slaves. Newspaper articles from 1858 mentioned an incident at Thornwood Plantation involving an escaped slave. Veteran records showed a man named Elijah Freeman served in the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry. The pieces could be assembled. The truth could be found if you looked. In 2010, a coalition of local historians and civil rights activists successfully lobbied for a historical marker. It was placed on County Road 12 where Thornwood Plantation once stood. The land is farmland now. Soybeans and corn where cotton once grew. But the marker acknowledges what happened. Reed's site of Thornwood Plantation 1847 to 1865. In August 1858, an enslaved man named Elijah defeated his master Calvin Thornwood in single combat and escaped to freedom. His courage inspired countless others to resist oppression. His story reminds us that even in the darkest times, resistance is possible. Small acknowledgement, incomplete account, but better than nothing, better than silence, better than pretending it never happened. The marker gets visitors. Descendants of Elijah come to see where it happened. Civil rights groups bring students to learn the story. People leave flowers and stones. Small tributes to a man who refused to accept his fate. Who fought back? Who won? What do you think of Elijah's story? Was his violence justified? Should he have run instead of fighting? Should Sarah and the others have helped him knowing the consequences? Should he feel guilty about the suffering his escape caused others? These questions don't have easy answers. Violence and resistance to oppression is morally complex. Helping someone escape when it brings punishment on yourself requires extraordinary courage. Surviving when others don't creates burden of guilt. But what's undeniable is that Elijah refused to accept his fate, chose to fight, chose freedom over safety, and through intelligence, planning, and courage, achieved what seemed impossible. His story matters because it counters the myth of the passive slave. The myth that enslaved people accepted bondage, that they didn't resist, that they waited for white saviors to free them. Stories like Elijah's prove otherwise. Prove that resistance was constant, that people fought back in every way they could, that they were strategic, brave, and dangerous when given opportunity. The system of slavery required overwhelming violence to maintain because the people being enslaved never stopped fighting it. If you found this story powerful, subscribe to the channel. Share it with people who need to understand that resistance is always possible. That courage matters. That ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things. That systems of oppression aren't permanent. That the weak aren't always weak and the strong aren't always strong. Until next time, remember, history is full of moments when someone refused to accept injustice. When someone stood up despite overwhelming odds. When someone fought back and won. Be that person when your moment comes. Until next video.